Chapter 16. Blessed Assurance. On Saturday, after helping Mrs. Malone with the baking, Beth asked Ned to take her to the school. The skies had cleared, and the building looked, if not brighter, at least less dismal. Ned swept the bare floor, straightened the lines of double desks, logs really, with rough board tables as desk-tops, and wiped away the summer's dust. Beth suggested that the boy lay a fire in the big wood stove while she decorated. "Never saw it look so purty," Ned said, after she had made bouquets of colored leaves and Oregon grapes. "Can I help more?" "Yes, if you have a pocket knife, cut out the letters for welcome back." She handed him scraps of wrapping paper. Ned did a fine job with making the letters, but when it came to arranging them, he was lost. Spelling was a problem with the boy, undoubtedly. "I'll have to find a way to help," she thought. On the way home, the two of them stopped to pick hazelnuts. "They're fun for roasting over the fire," Ned promised for the evening ahead. Sunday was clear and cold. A crisp wind blew in overnight, bringing what O'Higgin called butcherin' weather. The beef he spoke of would be put up in jars. "First, we be eatin' all we can. Then, what we can't eat, we can." Beth smiled at his wit. "Natural as his breathin'," Mrs. Malone said of it, but something within her recoiled a little at his words. Winter was near, no doubt about it. She pressed her cheek against the pane of the front room window and found it cold. A playful breeze was teasing the speckled leaves from the oak in the yard, and although clouds were swept behind the mountains, a thin wisp of fog trailed warningly below the peaks. Something whispered frost. "All aboard!" O'Higgin called from the wagon. Since Mrs. Malone had discovered that there was room for them all in the wagon if they sort of scrooched up, she no longer felt in the way. Mrs. Malone laid a quilt over the children's feet. They promptly pulled it over their heads, with Wolf in the middle, and huddled together happily. On the way to church, Beth heard strange cries overhead, and then a familiar voice called out, "Canadian honkers!" Joe had joined the Malone wagon at the intersection. It was good to see him, she thought fleetingly, then returned her eyes to the sky. For a moment she envied the honkers, free creatures heading for the southern climates, but their cries reminded her that they weren't so free after all. They, too, were escaping. "Wilson," Joe interrupted her thoughts, "is giving Doc Dulles a hand over the weekend." He made no further explanation. Would Joe ask her to ride with him? He did not. The circuit rider, to the pleasure of the congregation, appeared unexpectedly for worship service. He would be around for a few days, if somebody can sort of board and keep me. Hands went up everywhere. This meant that they could be marrying off the young folks who had been waiting, have the man say the proper words for those who had suffered losses in their families, and enjoyed news of what was going on in churches of the widely scattered communities. Joe made a special effort to introduce Jonas Brown to Beth, saying, "He's been a great help to me." She wished she had been able to concentrate on the man's sermon. There should be a word of appreciation, probably, but a polite curtsy was all she could manage. The look of surprise on the preacher's face told her that such acknowledgment of an introduction labeled her as a newcomer, maybe a foreigner. It was a little embarrassing, and she regretted the formality that her own church had demanded back home. Of course, she had been expected to listen then, too, knowing that there would be a test on the sermon before her stepfather would allow her and Vanjie to eat. Well, at least nobody was going to test her here, she hoped. Her mind had been on all the problems that lay ahead, problems which a demanding schedule had allowed her no time to think about until the quiet of the today. The dreaded first day of school, where she could find lodging, what she and Vanjie were to do. When all the Malones were loaded into the wagon, O'Higgin offered a hand to the two women. "Trouble is when there be preachin', there be too little song." The children heard and came from beneath the quilt. "Let's sing!" they all shouted at once. The Irishman needed no coaxing. "Bringin' in the sheaves," he announced, glancing at the burnished heads of late-ripening grain still in the fields. As the group sang, Beth joined in tentatively. It felt good to sing. It had been a long time, she realized suddenly, since she had sung. Mama had said she had a good voice, one of the few things she praised about her older daughter. On and on they sang, the wagon wheels and horses' hooves seeming to keep time to their voices. Without realizing it, Beth's own voice rose above the others. Her contralto seemed to drift up the mountain slopes and come back like an echo chorus. The others had stopped singing, even O'Higgin, as she sang "Blessed Assurance, Jesus is Mine," and stopped. The group, apparently thinking she had forgotten the words, picked up the refrain. Actually, she needed to think. Blessed assurance. The phrase echoed again and again, this time against the slopes of her heart, and then she remembered one phrase of Scripture quoted at last Sunday's service, "Help thou my unbelief." Gripping the armrest of the spring seat, Crispeth tasted the words and found them sweet. Maybe, just maybe, the answers would come. This, after all, was a land of miracles. Chapter 17. First Day, Its Awful Glory. November certainly put on its most somber garments for the first day, Crispeth thought as she prepared herself to greet students of assorted sizes and colors who romped around the schoolyard. Earlier, dark clouds had bumped against the mountains, dumping scattered showers in the valley. Even now, fog was caught along the summit, as if in silent watch. At least there would be no need to caution the children to wipe their shoes, not with a dirt floor. It would be damp, though. She bent stiffly to light the fire Ned had laid. She would probably be unable to walk tomorrow, she supposed, after her first ride astride a horse. O'Higgin had saddled the speckled pony for her. A check of the hard enameled watch pinned onto the lapel of her jacket said it was time to call the children inside. Crispeth smoothed her dark hair and on impulse tucked a bronze chrysanthemum behind a heavy braid. Mrs. Malone had picked an enormous armload in preparation for what she called the awful glory of the first day. "Just movin' gentle-like, knowin' water finds its own level," she had said with her usual insight. "Things will right up before you know it. Nothing's ever so horrible or so wonderful, as the case may be, as the first time around." Crispeth remembered and smiled as she pulled at the rope suspended to the giant outside dinner bell. 31 children, eyeing her suspiciously, lined up and marched in wordlessly. "Good morning, children," she said brightly, hoping that her nervousness did not show. "I'm your teacher." Immediately a hand shot up. The little girl in a faded pinafore, one of the Goldsmith children, Chris believed, spoke in a voice as wee as herself. "What do we call you?" "I'm Miss Kelly." The child nodded. "But what do we call you?" Confused, Crispeth was about to repeat her surname when Ned Malone came to the rescue, politely lifting his hand for recognition. The boy said, "She means last year we called Miss Andrews Miss Lizzie." First names, then. But Crispeth was too cumbersome, let alone Miss Kristen Elizabeth. Well, if that other Elizabeth could be Miss Lizzie, she could be. "Call me Miss Chrissy," she smiled, liking the sound of it. 1 year's teaching in a city school was little help to a situation like this. Would they like to share a little of what they had done over the summer? The children stared at her blankly. Why, when we all did the same, their looks asked her. Well, then, they could introduce themselves, and she would enter their names and grade level in the roll book. The Malones, she knew, of course, one of them in 7 of the 8th grades. Ditto for the Goldsmiths, except that she would need to know their first names. Crispeth recognized some of the other children from having met their parents at Sunday services, but they were strangers, too. She especially noticed a little almond-eyed boy who sat with folded hands apart from the others. "Your name, please?" She made a point of smiling. There was no reply. "He can't talk," one of the children said. "A mute? But no." "He can, too, talk," another contradicted. "He just talks Chinaman." "Chinese," she corrected, and smiled again at the frightened child. "I'll help." An especially bright-eyed child told Crispeth, "I can speak it a little." Good. Crispeth decided that the boy was probably as bright as his eyes. "I'll need his name, and yours." "He's Wong Chu. They live in railroad camp way off somewhere. The others don't come to school." He inhaled importantly. "And me? I'm Will, with 1 L. Young Will, I'm called, or Willie. Just write it down. Willie Ames." My, this one was a talker. Crispeth smiled in amusement. The job finished, Crispeth felt a bit more at ease, but there was the matter of curriculum. With a sudden burst of inspiration, she announced that they would just start in where they left off last year. The children seemed satisfied. They rifled through sacks and satchels, bringing out papers, most of them dog-eared and dirty, and a few thin books, too old for titles to be readable. These were the supplies the board chairman had promised the children would bring. But there were more surprises to come, none of them reassuring. "Oh, I brung a ball," one child announced, and promptly bounced it on the dirt floor. 6 others, inspired by the boy's bravery, followed suit. Startled, Crispeth confiscated the balls and announced that they would become school property. The children were awed to silence, and she knew she had won. Now to use the discipline constructively. "We all enjoy ball games, if assignments are completed, if the floor is swept, if the wood is brought in, and if," she stressed, "we all behave ourselves." "Base hit," she congratulated herself. "Now," she said matter-of-factly, "let's get down to business." There would be a division of labor. A what? Older students will help the younger ones. 2 recesses plus 45 minutes at noon. But teacher some has to go. Well, yes, in emergencies. And there's a barrel stave outside for wiping your shoes on before coming back if it's raining. That was young Will again. Most of the children had slates, a few of them new, but mostly broken pieces. One child drew out a shingle that someone had worked very hard to smooth with a jackknife. On it, the little girl was laboriously lettering her ABCs with a chunk of soft red rock. Crispeth's throat ached with compassion. What she couldn't do with a little bit of money she had always taken for granted. At recess time, an 8th grade boy, he claimed, sauntered up. Miss Chrissy, this is my baby sister, he said. Yes, she remembered the frail, frightened little girl. Ma wanted I should tell you she ain't had no time, so she ain't learnt her nothin'. Crispeth supposed the gawkish boy's explanation would have been amusing at one time. Even now it would make a cute little story for some afternoon tea back home, but to her, these children's teacher, it was heartbreaking. There's an awful gap between us, she thought, but somehow that was no threat any more. Neither they nor I can push through it, but I understand boys and girls, and they understand me. I'll do what everybody else does in this new land. I'll simply build a stile across that gap, and we'll all climb over. And there was an awful glory in the thought, or was it a revelation?